Welcome, I'm Levi from Voyager Beverages. Today we're going to be doing an instructional pour-over video to show you how we make some of the best coffee. Today we're using the Hario V60 method, which is a pour-over dripper designed by Hario Products that has a 60-degree brewing channel to help extract maximum flavor out of coffee. Underneath it, this part here is called a range server, and that's really a basin to catch the water. And you'll see on the side here we also have some measurements that help us tell how much liquid is actually in the range server at any time. Underneath that, I have a Hario drip scale. Now, there's multiple different types of scales out there, but two things that you'll need to make sure you look out for on a scale is to find a scale that can both time as well as tell you the weight in grams. Now, that can also be ounces, but it's a little bit harder to do that mental math. So the first thing we need to do is get a paper filter into the Hario V60 brewer. Now, one thing that's super important for the quality of your pour-over is to make sure that you rinse this paper filter. Paper always has some of these particles, so we just put a little water on the filter before we start brewing to make sure that we wash out any paper flavors. I'm going to do that here, which will do two functions, where it will also start warming the glass for us. This makes sure too that the glass is ready to receive the warm coffee and keeps the end product warmer as we're brewing it. So I'll switch that around a little bit, get my glass nice and hot, and dump that in the closest drain. Now, my range server, dripper, and filter are rinsed, warm, and ready to brew. Now, when we brew pour-overs, we can control three major factors in coffee, and that also translates to higher quality. That is the grind size and extraction rate, the time that we're putting water in contact with the coffee, as well as the temperature in which we're brewing the coffee. I've set my temp kettle to 205 for this brew today, and I have 32 grams of coffee here. Now, if you ran the ratios for that, you'd find out that we're making about 60 ounces of coffee today, and that we're using about a 16 to 17 ratio for coffee. Pour-over coffee is typically brewed 16 to 18 parts of water per part of coffee. And that's another reason that grams makes it a little bit easier. Let's get brewing. First thing I'm going to do is grind my coffee medium fine. What that's going to do is allow me to brew a coffee that lets the flow rate of the water go just long enough to make this whole brewing process 3.5 to 5 minutes long, depending on the coffee and the size of coffee that you're trying to brew. In this case, about 500 milliliters or 16 ounces. The first thing I'm going to do is tear out my scale and measure my coffee to 32 grams. Once our coffee is in, there's a couple different schools of thought. We can tap this to distribute the coffee bed, or we can stir it after we've added our bloom. There's a couple of different steps to pour-over brewing. One is called the bloom, which is where we let the water interact with the coffee grind and essentially bloom, which is a massive release of CO2 as water comes into contact with the coffee. This allows the coffee to open up, and we start the brewing process without fully extracting the coffee flavors immediately. That allows the coffee to really refine itself. Now, make sure that you're staying towards the middle of the coffee when you're pouring over, because that reduces fines migration. Fines are those little tiny particles you can almost barely see when you grind coffee. And what happens in the pour over that is what creates, I would say, probably 50 to 60% of the worst pour overs is that we pour to the outside of this area, and that allows fines to migrate towards the bottom and collect the tip, reducing the flow of water, which then reduces and over extracts the coffee. So we want to make sure that we don't do that, and in order to inhibit that, in the Hario V60, which is different than other pour-over drippers, is we want to stay about a $0.50 to $0.25 size circle in the middle of the coffee bed. Now, the first thing I'm going to do right now is tear out my scale again and start my timer as I pour over coffee to start the bloom. For this size of coffee, I'm going to use 100 grams of water to begin the blooming process, which is just enough to saturate the bed and start somewhat of a brewing process without overly saturating the coffee. I'm going to tear out my bloom and allow this to drip through. What this is doing is essentially getting the coffee prepared to extract. And now I'm going to time my brews so that I'm hitting different levels of extraction at different times. Now, one thing that some people like to do at this point, and while they're brewing, is stir this top. While that can lead to some fines migration, it can also boost extraction. It's a different school of thought, but one that works for some people. Now that I'm at 45 seconds, I'm going to start my first of my pulse pours. This is the pulse pour method, whereas some people use a constant pour, where they would just start this and not stop until their target weight's achieved. I'm going to pulse pour this coffee, which means I'm going to pulse about 150 grams of water over the next 30 seconds and then rest 15 seconds in between each pour, maintaining a small quarter-like size pouring radius or diameter in the middle of the coffee. I'm at 140 grams and I'm going to stop right at 150, and I'm going to let this continue to drip for about 15 to 20 seconds. While that's happening, the coffee has now been opened up and is ready to extract and is slowly dripping through. I'm getting close to my 20-second mark and I will start the next pour. We want the tip of the water where it's hitting the coffee to start to break up and be about the size of a pencil tip. That's going to give us just enough disturbance in the coffee bed, as well as promote just enough water going into the coffee to extract at the same rate that it's coming out the bottom. Now, I'm going to do some math here, because I poured 150 in the first pour, and I want to pour 150 in this pour. I'm going to stop when my scale reaches 300 grams. If I did this and timed this rate, that should be also about the same time that it hit 2.5 minutes of brew. I just hit 300 grams at 225 seconds. So I'm right on track to a good cup of coffee. Now, I typically pour in 3 pulses, which means I'm going to have one more pulse that should take me to about 450 grams. Now, because I poured 100 gram bloom, if you do the math, that's a little bit over the 500 I'm targeting, so I might pull up short depending on how much water and extraction I have, which changes by coffee, by temperature, and time. And that's why we use this method to control all of those factors. Now that I'm at 3 minutes, I'm going to start the last pour. And again, I'm going to shoot for 450 or 425 grams, depending on how the coffee is extracting. And at this rate, it looks like I'm safe to go to a full 450, and I'll meet my metrics right on time with my pours stopping 3 minutes and 30 seconds into the brew cycle. While we allow this to continue to drip, we take a deep breath, smell the coffee. Now, once this is done, finished extracting, as it pretty soon will, we'll go ahead and remove this paper filter from the top and discard however you typically discard your coffee grounds. It's also a great way to use it as a fertilizer or something else for some other use in your household. And we want to get our mug ready. Hot into the glass, hot into the mug. We'll rinse this out with a little bit of hot water just to warm things up and get it ready to receive this delicious coffee. Now, if you look on the side of my range server, you'll see that our total brewed coffee has come up to about 500 milliliters. Right on target for my precise brewing. We have our own recipes here that we dial in each coffee to make it precise. And I suggest that you play around and do the same, because at the end of the day, it's just more ways to enjoy coffee and find out what you like. I'll now remove this filter. Take off our coffee Hario V60 O2 Dripper. And I like to aerate my coffee a little bit, so I'll give it some pouring action to incorporate some air. And that's it. Enjoy. Delightful. Well, if you enjoyed this, be sure to check out some of our other videos. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe, and we'll see you soon in some of our other videos.